in this notion that we're a fictional race of Indians, that we're just this one big blob of Indians, a race of people you can measure by blood and hair color and eye color, and that completely ignores our nationhood status, the Cree Nation, the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Mohawk Nation, the fact that we all have different languages, cultures, and customs, but not just different languages, cultures, and customs, because then that reduces us just to a multicultural group. But we also have different governments, different laws, different military alliances, different trade networks. We're also governments, we're also political entities, not just cultural entities. And I think that's an important difference when we're looking at what is Idle No More. It can and should be something different to each different nation because everyone has their own priorities. There's no one Idle No More for the entire world. Imagine trying to force Canada as a nation to have the same objectives as Venezuela or Cuba. It wouldn't happen. Well, our nations can be just as different. They can be very similar, but they're also very different, and it's about recognizing that difference. Here's what Idle No More is not, equally important. We don't have any elected national chief controlling this. We don't have any politicians. We don't have any paid CEOs. There's no corporation. Idle No More is not sponsored by Enbridge Pipelines. Not sponsored by McDonald's or Coke. Right? We are not beholden to anybody. This is about living our sovereignty and doing what it is that we want. There's no one leader or spokesperson. Nobody controls or dictates activities. Now you'll see there's lots of different groups on Facebook that will say, we want Idle No More to do this or that or the other thing. Some people are trying to copyright Idle No More, and there's a whole bunch of other things. That's just natural in a movement of people with different views and agendas. But the movement itself will never be controlled by anybody because it's the people. It's the people who decide what happens and what doesn't happen and whether they participate or don't and in what way. Also, Idle No More is not challenging any political organization. This isn't a movement saying, we hate you, Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, so this is the alternative and we want to tear you down. This movement is focused on positive steps moving forward in terms of sovereignty and nation building. It's not about politics. We've left all of the politics out of it. They don't have any say over what's going on. However, just because they don't have any say in the political sense, it doesn't mean that the First Nations leaders on the ground aren't involved, because they are very much involved, or I wouldn't even be standing here today. That's different because our leaders are part of our grassroots people. Our leaders are part of our communities. We can't separate them any more than we would separate our elders or separate our women. And I think that's something that's extremely important going forward. And of course, it's not political in the federal or provincial sense. We don't have Stephen Harper supporting Idle No More, and that's okay. We don't want him to. I kind of like that he doesn't. Now the core messages. What is it that we're trying to tell people? What is it that we're trying to get our kids to tell people? What messages have we been trying really hard to give to the media? Well, I think one of the most profound messages about this movement is that First Nations in this country represent Canadians' last best hope at protecting the lands, plants, animals, waters, and resources in this country for future generations. And why do I say that? Because they have lots of wealth, they have lots of numbers, they have lots of political influence, but you know what they don't have? They don't have our Aboriginal and treaty rights. They don't have our inherent rights that come from the fact that we are the protectors and guardians of this territory. And those rights are constitutionally protected in the highest law of their land, the Constitution. They need us to stop what's happening in this country. And so by standing beside us, everybody's going to win here. And that changes the power dynamic. It means that we have the power here, and we're exercising it. And that's why you've seen so many Canadians and Americans and international people standing beside us, because it just doesn't impact Canadians either. If we pollute irreparably the Mackenzie River Valley Basin. Who does that harm? BC, Alberta, Northwest Territories, all of the Arctic Circle, the United States. The Mackenzie River Valley Basin is one of the most important international water basins in the entire world. It controls the sea, it controls the air temperature, it controls life all over the world. That's how important our job is. We don't even have the option, once you know, you don't even have the option not to do something about it anymore. Because now you know, once you know, you're on the hook. But it's the same for Canadians. We don't share that responsibility alone. The other core message is that this is about sovereignty. And not sovereignty in the way that Canadians panic when you think about Quebec and they want to separate from Canada and all that other stuff, which don't worry, they can because it's our land. But sovereignty in the sense of recognizing our right, our inherent right. And inherent, for anyone who doesn't know what that means it's not given to you. You have it by virtue of being who you are. The fact that we're the first peoples of this land and we've always governed ourselves, been self-determining since time immemorial, that's what sovereignty is. Managing our own communities, managing our own families, managing our own lives. That's what sovereignty is. It's in individuals and it's in nations. And that's a core message of this movement, that's something worth protecting. The fact that it's nation to nation. You probably heard in the media when all those meetings were happening in Ottawa, why on earth did anyone want the Governor General to go to a meeting with First Nations and Prime Minister Harper? What a silly thing to ask. But it's not silly, because a part of our treaties is also the spirit, intent, sacredness, and ceremony that goes around it. Canada wasn't involved in any of that. It was the crown, the person who wears the real crown that lives overseas, that was involved in that treaty-making process. If for nothing else but the spirit, intent, and symbolism of that, that's why the Governor General was wanted there. But for me, I saw it as a much more important role, because people think the Governor General, who represents the Queen here in Canada, only has symbolic power. Not the case. The Governor General has one of the most significant powers under Canadian law. That Governor General holds sovereign powers of the Queen here in this country, and he has the power to remove the Prime Minister if he acts above the rule of law or he takes his government in an unconstitutional direction. And Prime Minister Harper is doing both. That means the Governor General has the power to kick him out of office right now. And he doesn't have to go to court to do it. He doesn't have to file an appeal record to do it. That's a very significant power. It hasn't been exercised, but he has it. So it's more than just symbolism. And so both parties need to account here. Both the Crown for the failure to talk to us before they unilaterally tried to transmit treaty rights to Canada, and Canada's failure as the administrator of those treaty rights to implement those rights. That's why both parties had to be at the table. That's why it was so important, because we are in a nation-to-nation relationship. Here's the other really important point that we've been saying. It's about time we started sharing the wealth here. We had 100% of the territory in this country, 100%. Now, do you know what our reserve lands total to? 0.2% of all the land we ever used to have. That's like the size of Vancouver Island. How are we in this situation? And people would say it's because you gave up all your lands, and we didn't give up all our lands. We know what the true spirit and intent of those treaties were. So you have a situation now in Canada where First Nations live in substandard conditions, many. But this is Stephen Harper's house. I find it really hypocritical when the government will stand in the media and say, how dare a chief make $60,000 a year when his community members are homeless? How dare Stephen Harper live in a mansion paid for free when this country has increasing poverty? Why is there a double standard here? We need to start having a different kind of conversation. And that's what sharing the wealth is all about. But it's not just sharing the wealth, it's also protecting the lands, waters, plants, and animals. We have an obligation to do that. In my tradition, in the Mi'kmaq tradition, every time we took something, we had to give something back. Whether it was a ceremony, whether it was making sure that we didn't take too many fish, whether it was giving it to somebody in our community, every time you take, you got to give back, because you just can't keep taking indefinitely. And we have to get back to those traditional principles. And Canadians also have to understand that all of that is incorporated in the treaties. They might not have written that out in English, but they dealt with us as a nation. They think they can incorporate their rules, well, our laws also get incorporated. So it's about time First Nation laws around how we protect and manage our territories are given equal standing in this country. And then there's something called the rule of law. Harper likes to talk about that all the time. And when these Idle No More movement first started, they said, we want First Nations to respect the rule of law. No round dancing in the middle of the street. Here's what the rule of law is in Canada. The highest law in Canadian law, not in First Nation law, but Canadian law is the Constitution. Our Aboriginal and treaty rights are protected in that Constitution, which means it trumps every other law in Canada. Thank you very much. Just in case I need 3 bottles really quickly. This must be a sign I'm going to get some tough questions. Yeah, so the rule of law. Every time the Prime Minister tries to introduce a piece of legislation that will impact our Aboriginal and treaty rights, he is breaking the rule of law. Because the rule of law says you cannot alter constitutional rights without following a constitutional amendment process, and you can't infringe on constitutional rights without doing a process of consultation and accommodation. But even that law has changed, because now we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which the United Nations says represents customary international law. It applies to Canada whether Canada likes it or not. Now what does it say in UNDRIP? That now, it's not about consultation and accommodation anymore, it's about consent. They have to get our consent before they do anything that impacts our lands, our governments, our peoples, our education, our Aboriginal and treaty rights. And knowledge is power. The more we know that and the more we assert those rights, we can start changing the conversation. Because as long as we're talking about consultation, it's not the same as consent. Consent is, yeah, we go ahead or we don't, but that's our choice. We want to work together with you as a treaty partner. In consultation, the way it works for the federal government is they'll give you a little bit of information, call that an engagement session, and then they'll pass the law as they see fit. Take them to court if you don't like it. Well, now we have the rule of law on our side. What sparked Idle No More? Why did it come about? It seemed like literally overnight. Well, okay, so there is some subliminal messaging in my presentation. It is a bit anti-Harper, but you can forgive me. Harper's treason is the reason for protest this season. Right? That pretty much says it all. The fact that he instituted a whole suite of legislation